Hi everyone, it's Grandmaster Josh Friedel, and today I'd like to share with you some secrets of locked positions. As you may have noticed, I have a green screen behind me, which I'm not really using for this video, but that does mean I am recording my next Chessable course very soon. If you'd like to check out my first one, the link's in the description. It's targeted toward beginners, but intermediate players definitely have told me it has some challenges, so definitely check that out if you'd like. The links below. But yeah, I'm excited to record my next one. It's centered on the middle games. The first one was in the openings. The last part, you guessed it, will be the end games. So covering like standard beginner mistakes, things like that. But today I wanted to cover some closed positions. I actually want to focus on one game in particular, which I haven't been doing with these videos as frequently, but I wanted to do it for this because it was a really cool learning opportunity for me, and I thought that I would share with you kind of some things that I learned and what I thought about it. It was a game played very recently at the American Cup in St. Louis. It was between Alice Lee, who ended up being the champion in a really dramatic playoff. I didn't get to watch it, but I heard about it. It was pretty cool. Against Grandmaster Irina Krush, who's been kind of dominating the U.S. women's chess scene for a very long time. So it's sort of a up and coming talent against sort of the one of the veterans who dominates. So it was kind of a cool matchup, and yeah, I definitely recommend following those kind of events. And Alice is definitely a player to watch. I mean, she's already so strong, and she's getting stronger by the year. So it should be really really cool. But I wanted to go over this game because there were so many interesting moments, and you got a very unusual type of position. And when I was watching it, it occurred to me it's the type of position that's really hard to play. There are certain players who are quite good at these kind of positions, but for the most part, for most chess players, and I would even include myself with this, they're very challenging to play in a lot of ways because the rules are different. Like playing locked positions, the rules aren't really the same. So I wanted to cover that as well as show some interesting moments from the game. I'm not going to go over everything in huge detail, but I did want to start at the beginning just so you see how it happens. So you ended up getting this, and then a Banco? No, a check Benoni, this is called, I believe. And the idea is that white's not really encouraged to take this pawn because that would give up a very strong central pawn, and black is trying to completely close the center. So you have a pawn structure you often see in a King's Indian, but one difference you'll see, just so you know, make sure we're all on the same page here. King's Indian structure looks like this, and I'm just going with the standard one. I'm not playing a sideline. So let's just pretend white's playing the main line, and we go like this, and at some point, usually after castling, you get this position. So notice how you have these pawns against these pawns. And this is quite standard. However, you'll notice that black has the pawn back on c7, which can do different things. Sometimes black can attempt to use this c5 square. Other times white will, and very often white will try to play c5. So the black pawn on c5 has some advantages. So if we go back to the position in this game, you'll see that the pawn on c5 has some advantages because you prevent this c5 break, but you're also making a break like a3, b4 a bit stronger. And it also takes time, right? If you played c5, it's also a tempo investment, and that's the thing that I think people forget about. Even in closed positions, tempi matter, even though in closed positions they often matter less. So the fact that black had to play c5 and use a tempo to do so is also significant. So in this position, knight bd7 was played, which is an interesting choice. I would say that at least historically, with this structure, this knight move is considered not always such a great place. Like sometimes you play knight a6 to c7. Other times you just delay it entirely and just play like bishop e7 castles or some version of g6. But knight bd7 is of course fine, and I think it's like a modern way to play this. But clearly the attempt is to get that Irina is doing, and this is something that Irina does pretty well in these events, which is that she gets people out of their comfort zones and uses the fact that she's experienced and has good understanding of the game to try to outplay people and, make sure they're not like where they're in positions they're comfortable with. So it's something she does very well. And that was kind of the attempt here. So I didn't want to talk about the opening too much. The kind of standard, if you gave this to me and we're like, what do you do? I mean, normally like g3, bishop g2, either knight to e2 or f3 in castles. So I can show it just a little bit. So it often looks something like this. You play like this, Knight f3 or knight e2. I happen to like knight f3, but it's kind of dealer's choice in a sense. And the idea is that you play knight e1 to d3, and the knight on d3 does two things. It supports a3, b4 in some positions, and it also supports eventually playing for f4. The cool thing is, because you have the fianchetto bishop, because of the nature of the pawn structure, you're often able to play with either side. And that's something I want to make note of in this structure in general, that when you have this pawn structure, you always want to know, and this is true in any closed position, what are the pawn breaks? So pawn breaks are very important in such positions because you want to crack at your opponent's structure, generally speaking. So for white, the pawn breaks are going to be a3, b4, as well as, playing for f4, either with g3 or f4 right away. Black's pawn breaks are playing for b5 or playing for f5 when the knight moves. So this is stuff that a lot of people know, but the timing and how to play for these pawn breaks is actually very subtle and very tricky, and that's what I wanted to talk about because that's what a lot of people get tripped up. So Alice played knight g2. I actually don't care for this particular move order. Like, if you're going to play knight e2, I prefer bishop d3 first than knight e2, because you'll notice that she gets the same position, but her knight moves back and forth, which to me is not as logical. But again, these things are kind of fine. So Irina plays h5, which is actually a very typical move in these positions, especially against the knight on g3. So my instinct here would be to play h4. In general, I don't think there's a reason to allow h4. And the general theme is that if black plays the same idea they played in the game, you can trade the bishops, play bishop d3, queen d2, and the general idea is you play f3, you fix this bum knight on g3, move it to e3, and then eventually maybe try to play for g4, or occasionally g3, f4, depending on kind of where pieces go. And one of the things you'll notice is that it's very difficult for black to achieve a lot in a position like that, so you play it slow. But the very important thing is that you do not want to be in a rush. If you try to crack at black's position really fast, that's how you end up in a bad position. But I do think that putting the pawn on h4 and going for a maneuver like this is kind of a bit more standard. Again, this is just my knowledge of it, right? So everyone has their own impression. And then the general gist also is that if they put the bishop on g7, eventually bishop g5 is annoying. If you ever castle, you actually have to worry about sacrifices on h5, believe it or not. At least in some situations. So this kind of position also has its dangers. But bishop d3 is played by Alice. And this is what I mean by, clearly she just wasn't as familiar, right? You don't face the check Benoni very often. But the nice thing is, it's not a huge deal. Like, black got an h4, it's kind of nice, but it's nothing horrible has happened. And that's the other thing Irina does. She plays bishop h6. So this is something you see quite often, that when you have a closed structure like this, trading the bishop off of the pawns, trading the bishop off that is the color of your pawns is not a bad idea. Now, this is true more for the side that's cramped. So if you're really new to closed positions, if you can take away anything, it is that when you have a cramped position, trading pieces is often a great way to relieve the pressure. Because if you look at the drawback of a cramped position, right, it's the fact that you just don't have as many squares for your pieces. So it makes it less likely your pieces can find good squares. And what that means is white's pieces are far more likely to find good squares. Because you can maneuver, right? Like I mentioned in that other position, you can maneuver a knight to e3. Black can't maneuver a knight to e6, right? That's not a thing. So because of that, you really want to, that's why you try to crack at your opponent's extra space. That's why you do different things, right? Because that's the hard part about playing against this space advantage. So Irina's doing something very typical, which is trying to trade off these bishops. And that's what happens. Queen d2, rook h8. So what's really funny is that, everyone has their own impression of this. And it's kind of interesting because I think a lot of people overestimate this trade from the black side. They think that, okay, black traded the bishops, black's doing great. I see this all the time. I see it in French positions. Oh, I traded off my bad French bishop, I must be okay. But one of the features that people forget about all the time is time. And this is something I talked about earlier. Black played bishop h6, had to play g6, bishop h6, rook takes h6, and now rook back, while white developed a bishop that was on the back rank and played queen d2. Does this mean that what Irina played is bad? I don't think so. It looks fine to me. But taking into account the time investment is very important. Now, if you have an open position, the time investment's even more important. You would never do this in an open position, ever, because it's too slow. You cannot, in an open position, give up 2-3 tempi. It just never happens. For the most part, right? Like, if you're grabbing a pawn and you give up 3 tempi for it in an open position, you're probably in trouble. 3 tempi is just way too many. However, in a closed position, I almost call it like playing chess, like in a block of ice, right? Like, everything's slower, which means that the value of the tempi is not as much, and that's why black can get away with this. However, they're not valueless. They still matter. It still matters what you can play for, and you'll kind of see this in the next phase. But in this position, what's quite funny is I think Alice plays a move which surprised me, and in my opinion, it's a bit of a mistake, even though it's a very typical looking move, which is she plays the move a3. So she obviously wants some kind of b4 break. Now, it's hard to put yourself in opponent's thoughts. It could be very, like, different things. She could have not known where to castle. She could have been thinking about castling kingside. She could have been worried about the knight on d7 moving, in which case b4 targets the c-pawn and is annoying against that. There could have been many reasons for this move. But in my opinion, it's a mistake. And it looks weird because, well, isn't white playing for one of the breaks they should be playing for? But here's the thing. Every closed position, they're all a little different. So one of the features here is that because black's gotten in this h-pawn push essentially for free, remember, that's one of the other reasons why black can get away with playing a bit slower, because white's played knight e2 to g3 and back, right? But because of this pawn on h4, I think it's very unlikely white's castling kingside. You can, it's not unplayable, but I think it looks kind of weird to do it here because of that. And because black has ready-made counterplay, like black will maybe put the king on g7. Notice that black cannot castle because black has already played rook takes h6, rook h8. Black can maneuver the knights in, the queen in, etc. It's very playable, but it doesn't feel like particularly dangerous. So that means the plan is almost certainly to castle queenside, and I think Alice should just do it. And then one of the key things is when you castle queenside, the position changes a fair amount. Meaning that black is very unlikely to put the king on the queenside as well. I think that it's extremely difficult to do that because they'd have to play like b6, bishop b7 that looks horrible, or knight, like it's just too many moves. So the black king is likely going to g7, which is what happened in the game. There are moments where you can play king d8 to c7, but in this particular position, I don't like it. And the reason for that is because there are Nimzo structures where that happens, but the white pawn is here, if you can picture that. So then the king on c7 is a bit more stable. It's a Karpov idea to play like this. But I don't really like it here because white is able to create a pawn break, which is very annoying against the king, even with the white king castled. So in any case, I think black will likely play for b5. And here there are different kinds of options. One option against this kind of pawn push is you can ignore it. So the way that would look is usually like a move like, say, f3 to cover your center, b5. Now, you might be able to take this pawn, but something like this is actually fairly common, and the whole point is that taking on c4 doesn't do that much. And if they ever play b4, you can maneuver your knight to e3, where it actually is like a very decent piece. And it's very hard to attack with just these two pawns, because even if the pawn goes all the way to a3, you can play b3. If they play b3, you can play a3. It's very hard to open up the game over there. So what that means, and this is extremely important, that when one side of the board gets locked like this, it means that the play gets entirely concentrated on the other side of the board. And what that means is that whichever side should be doing better over there tends to have an advantage. Now, you would think that because black put a pawn on h4, black would be better, but I don't actually think that's true. And the reason why, number one, it's very likely the black king will go there, or at the very least, will have to spend many tempi fixing itself to go to c7 or something. White has a ready-made idea of eventually playing for f4. And black's pieces just have less room, which means that white's rooks are connected, white's pieces are stronger, which means that the action here, in my opinion, should favor white. So for that reason, I don't think that black would be anxious to close off the position. And taking on c4, you can even retreat sometimes. You're just not doing very much. So that's kind of another way to play, but a4 is also pretty reasonable. And this is the kind of move that a lot of people see this and they're like, what on earth are you doing? And it's definitely a move that would have surprised me probably even 7, 8 years ago. Before I'd seen ideas like this, I would have been like, why are you playing a4 after you castled? What's wrong with you? But it's actually quite a normal idea, and the whole point is that you're making b5 very difficult to achieve. If you try to play b5 here, I can even just take and take. The d-pawn's weak. If you try to check the king, I go up. No big deal. So for that reason, b5 is very difficult, and the whole problem that this creates for black is, once again, in the long term, because white has more space and superior pieces, white will be able to fight for the king side more effectively than black. And also, much more importantly, black's king is likely to be stuck on the king side, which means that the opening of the king side is not good for black, right? That's the nice thing about when you're opposite side castled, and this is true in closed positions a lot, it's really your job to make the action happen where your opponent's king is. Again, this is a great rule to remember. If your opponent's king is on one side of the board, yours is on the other, that side of the board is where you want the action, which means that even though you're giving up on this b4 pawn break by playing a4, you're basically saying, I'm just restricting you over here. So over here, white's playing for pure restriction. a4 looks like a weird move, but it makes b5 very difficult to achieve without sacrificing a pawn, and maybe black can sack it, right? But it's unclear that you're getting like a huge amount of compensation, and especially with the potentially weak d-pawn, it's just very difficult. So you want to make black pay a hefty price for playing b5 if you can, and if they can't play b5, eventually, slowly, you will try to win the king side. But these are things that I had to look at for a while to figure out. And some of the lines I gave, for example, of king f8, which would be played in the game, fairly logical. White plays f3. Notice how, even though eventually you're going to try to play for f4, you don't mind playing f3 first. First of all, slow position, taking your time is important. And you want to make sure you're preventing counterplay. You want to make sure you're not allowing like b5 and then the e4 pawn's loose. If you take on b5, you want everything nice and guarded. And it just makes it very hard for black to do much. h3 ideas are just don't do anything. You can play g3, even g4 sometimes. Probably g3, but king g7, rook here. And again, it's just really hard to do a lot. Eventually, your knight's probably maneuvering around, but for now, you can even just do this. Go here. Something like this was the line I came up with. And basically, white will eventually play for f4 and try to open up lines over here. But you can take your time. And I want you to also notice that if black tries to do something like this and hammers through with the rook, because your rook is just not developed, the bishop is stuck on c8, white can easily play here, trade off the rook, and black has achieved nothing, right? Like black, that's why like black can't really play on the king side. But as it was, a3 I don't like for the very reason that because white's castling here, this is actually not a side of the board you want to open up. Which means that, and Alice realized that, she's obviously a strong player, so you'll notice that after Irina played king f8 and white castled, again, I think it's the correct decision, but this a3 move almost feels wasted. Like it doesn't really have a place now. And if anything, after a3, b5, because b4, you've created a hook for the pawn, meaning that it's easier to open lines, this is actually not so good. So Irina plays king g7. And here, once again, Alice takes a, like she's clearly has her pawn breaks in mind, right? f4 and b4. But the key thing that I think is really important here, and it's something you learn with a bit more experience, which is that you want to play for them in a patient way. It's a slow position. Even though it's opposite side castling, it's not opposite side where you're both trying to hack each other to pieces right away. There's an element of you need to secure your position first. So the move I was looking at was f3. Again, not totally sure this is all best, but this is what I was looking at. Against a6, I still want to play a4, basically admitting a mistake. And now I think like it was really hard to create counterplay for black. I was looking at this move, trying to play queen g5. The idea, generally speaking, is that if black can play queen g5, it's very annoying because if you trade queens, then you can't really attack the king on g7, which means that black's a lot more secure. It's not that you can't trade queens. It's not like if you play rook if you play rook f1 and queen g5, it's some horrible thing. But you know, I definitely didn't want to allow it, so I wanted g3 now. The idea being that if queen g5, you can play f4 safely and avoid the queen trade. So knight g5, and again, this is a little weird. It's a little awkward because you'd like to play this move, but this tactic is rather nasty. The idea being that you can't take the knight because the rook on h1 hangs. And if you take the rook, I can play... what was the line here? Yeah, takes, and then this rook hangs. I don't know why that took me so long. But this was generally speaking the idea. Actually, there's also, hold on a second. Was there queen takes rook, and then maybe this is simpler because you have a check. I should pay more attention to these lines. But yeah, in general though, I didn't think that worked. So rook hf1 is quite playable. You could also play queen e3, is also a very reasonable move. But black's kind of fighting for these squares to not allow you to just take over the game over there right away. So Alice played g3, which again looks like a relatively normal move. But the problem is you're not supporting your center, and that makes you a lot more vulnerable to a6. Because here you would love to play a4, but now it doesn't work because I play b5, a b5, and there's actually a really cool idea, which is to play knight g4. And the problem is it's very difficult to defend everything, and you'll notice that with the pawn on f3, this idea just doesn't exist, right? The main reason you play b5 is so you can capture on b5 anytime you want. So just for example, if white plays here, trying to guard the pawn, it's actually not so easy to guard the pawn. If you play f3 here, you walk into a fork. Both rooks attacked. You take, and then the problem is rook a1 check. If you play king c2, I can take your rook and take on h2, and this gets very sad and embarrassing. Notice how the knight can even hop back to f3 and d4 if you want, but it could also go back to g4. This is just clearly not good. And if bishop b1, you can take, and notice how everything's just sort of loose. If you take with the h pawn, I can trade and take on f2. Taking with the f pawn is, I mean, you can probably still take on h2. I mean, it just doesn't look good. Something has clearly gone horribly, horribly wrong. So this a4 idea no longer works, which means that b5 is not really preventable. If I were white, I may have just gone for this. And this is my backup plan, right? The idea is that after b5, I go back here. If takes, I go bishop c2. I say, okay, have the pawn. I can put a knight on c3, knight on e3, pawn on f3. I'm like holding the fort down, you know? But notice how the way I want to play is much more defensive and kind of patient. And I think that it's often necessary in a position like this. Alice played a much more ambitious move, and it's kind of true to her style, but in this position it backfires a bit because it's just too ambitious for this particular position. There are certain positions where you should press forward quickly because your opponent has very strong ideas. But there are other positions where by pressing forward so quickly, you're actually giving up lots of squares yourself. And you're not equipped to defend them because your pieces are not so good. So I really wanted to play b5. This was the dynamic player in me screaming for this move. And there's all sorts of cool ideas here. For example, I think computer, when I looked at it, said c4 was strong, but I just wanted to take, and even c4 here I thought was really cool. The idea being that if takes, you can play queen b6, and if here, knight c5, for instance, and I mean, black's just getting oodles and oodles of counterplay. You have to sack some pawns, but this is, white is barely going to be able to defend. If queen c2, for instance, you have to worry often about sacrifices here, and bishop f5, and it's just going to be very difficult to defend and everything. I think one thing I looked at was maybe, I forget which knight, like this knight, say, bishop here. And the problem is that if you try to do this, I can take and then queen e3 check, and that's going to be very unpleasant because the knight is pinned and everything else. So, yeah, a lot of unpleasantness, let's put it that way. So, I don't know. b5 looked cool. I don't think white obviously has to go down that road. I'm sure I didn't play all the great moves. Irina actually chose something which I didn't think of, but is actually very logical as well, which is you're trying to sort of take over. Again, notice how white didn't prevent this move. White didn't close off these squares. So black's basically saying, well, you're pushing on the king side, but what are you really doing? And this is another important thing, like an argument for taking your time, because you'll notice that f4 was a rushed move, but what did it threaten, right? This e5 pawn is guarded. You never want to take and allow the knight d takes e5. That's horrible, right? You're giving your opponent space. You're giving them a square. f5, almost always terrible. So your pawn's not really doing anything, which means there's no rush to put it there. So making sure your position is secure first before you try to do stuff is really essential. Again, not that the position even here is necessarily so bad. So Alice plays rook at df1, which makes a lot of sense. hg, knight df6. So Irina's idea is to get these pieces in the game in this fashion. So white plays king b1, and there were different moments where I know there was stuff that happened. For example, I happen to know that this knight h2 move is strong, trying to play knight g4. You'll see that this is a common theme. Irina could have played it right away. She ended up going here first. Yeah, and here Alice chose, I think, a very unfortunate move. She played f5. And again, the problem is that the pawn on f4, you're not doing much yet, but the advantage of it is that because black usually doesn't want to allow the structure f takes e5, d takes e5, because then it's not so much the passed pawn on d5, which doesn't do much. It's the fact that e5 is then a potential weakness and black can't put a knight there. So for example, you don't want to take right away, not because of d takes, but because the knight will land here, and the knight on e5 is extremely powerful. But keeping this tension is nice because black doesn't want to take because you take with the g-pawn. So keeping the pawns there is kind of nice. What to do instead is a difficult matter. I think I was looking at like rook takes rook and like knight g1. This is obviously not a pretty move, but if you can get in knight f3 and put pressure on the pawn, I feel like it's at least somewhat playable. But yeah, f5 is definitely rather unfortunate. Again, Irina probably could have played knight h2. But rook b8 was played, which is fairly logical. Alice plays a4, and now Irina finds knight h2, which is a very nice move. Rook d1. And yeah, this was one moment where I thought things turned. And what I thought was quite interesting when watching this game is that it was clear to me that Irina understood the position better than Alice did, and therefore got a very good position. But what I was quite impressed with was that when Irina went astray a bit, which is obviously not so hard to do, it's a difficult position to play well, you'll notice that Alice jumped on her like right away. She was right there ready to take it. And that's not such an easy thing, especially when you have an unpleasant locked position. It's easy to get down on your position. It's like, oh, everything's locked. My opponent's pieces are all better than mine. What is happening? It's easy to get down on yourself. And I think what you can learn from Alice, and I mean, I could definitely learn this as well. It's something that I've definitely done wrong before, which is that she really stays in the game and waits for her opportunity. Another advantage I would say that a lot of people had, I don't know, I didn't see her, I don't remember her interview exactly or anything like that. But sometimes younger players also don't realize how bad their position is. And that can sometimes make it better. I'm pretty sure she wasn't happy about her position here. But again, she keeps fighting, she keeps playing. It's a really great thing to learn. So in this position, Irina slipped up. She played knight f3, which actually was very surprising to me, just because to me it seemed to improve white's position more than black's. Maybe she was happy about the knight landing on d4. But for me personally, white's so discoordinated, I don't want to help white improve the queen. So this is the move that I think is quite strong. And it actually can lead to some really, really nasty ideas. It's really hard to find a move. For example, one kind of cool idea is f knight g1. If you want to pause your video and find a nice move for black, now's a good time to do it. But it's actually the move knight to f1. Hitting the queen with check, and then this rook is also hanging. And if you go here, then I fork you again. And if rook takes rook, I can simply recapture and the rook on d1 hangs. This is kind of a nice little tactic. But it's really hard to find even just moves, right? Like it's just a really, really difficult position. Because knight f2 is also a threat. Knight f3 is actually really monstrous in lots of positions. For example, if rook c1, this is very funny. After knight f3, this queen is almost trapped. For example, if queen c2, knight e3, this queen is actually trapped. If queen b3, knight d2 check. It's amazing how devastating these knights are. Queen here is a better move, but even in this position, knight e3 is quite strong. You have to take and play queen h1, but at the very least, you can check and grab a pawn on c4. I mean, this is just horrible. But notice, and this is something important, when you have extra space, you have to be careful about pushing and taking more. So one advantage of extra space that people don't use enough is that when you have extra space, you can maneuver your pieces and you have more room to do so. So improving your pieces before you press is so important in a closed position. Again, every position is different. There are certain positions you have to rush, like, where you have to like try to checkmate your opponent, otherwise you lose, like a lot of Kings Indian. There are positions like that. But in a lot of cases, notice how Alice, because she pushed so quickly, she left all these squares kind of bare. So once this happened, notice how white just is in no position to defend any of these squares. A lot of it's because of poor piece coordination. But this happens a lot when you push prematurely. You simply can't defend the territory you took. It's like an army running too far, right? Then they get slaughtered, or you don't actually take that territory. So if you push too quickly, this is kind of what can happen. But you'll definitely notice that Alice started playing very well, especially once Irina started to go astray. So knight f3 was played, queen c1, and to me this just improves white, right? Queen c1 is clearly a move that coordinates the rooks. If you can play rook h8, rook h1. What's quite funny is white is actually the one who often will prefer piece trades here, even though white has more space, just because black's pieces are so much stronger than white's. Okay, so knight g4 was played, rook h8, rook h1. So yeah, this was one of the positions where like the best move's knight fh2, but that's not an easy move to play, to pin your own knight. It's kind of... yeah, this is not an easy move to play. It's very logical. Like when you see it, it makes sense because you don't want to give white the h-file. But queen g1. And here is where Alice, again, really started playing great. And again, it's not so easy to recover from a position that's so bad. But these are the qualities that make up really strong players. So if you'd like, try to find a really nice move for white. Pause your video. So Alice's move, again, you want to get rid of these knights. She plays knight g1. Beautiful move. I mean, it looks a little weird if you're not accustomed to seeing moves like this, but the basic idea is that you're really just forcing your opponent backwards, and that's a good thing. Or they have to trade off an active piece. So yeah, Irina could have put a knight on d4, but I think that there are problems because the rook and queen, you have to be very careful. Moves like queen h6 are always covered. White could even play like bishop e2 trying to hit the knight. There are all sorts of possibilities, but the basic theme is that the knight's not as good here as it might look. So Irina decides to trade, queen f6. So it's still like totally fine for black, but definitely white has play now. So I'm going to move a little bit fast here, even though there's a lot going on. But yeah, basically Alice now chases this knight away, which is really cool. So Irina has to play knight h6. You can be sure that she was not happy with her position here. Or at least she was getting unhappy. g4, she plays g5. Not the prettiest move, but again, fairly forced. You can't allow g5. So already things are kind of turning. Alice plays another move, which I absolutely love, which is bishop d1. The idea being that in a lot of positions now, you're clearing the way for this knight to come over. So this is a great way to improve pieces. So it clears the square and also defends the a4 pawn, so you don't have to sacrifice it. Irina realizes the knight on h6 is terrible, so she moves it. Queen e3. And this is a position, I think, where Irina really starts to go wrong. Because at this moment, I don't think her position is so bad. But the key thing to realize is that now is the time you have to activate your rook. Because at the moment, with what happened, she ended up just not being able to activate any of her pieces, and her position became impossible to play. So the move rook h2 was what came to my mind. I think computer prefer rook h4, but they're very similar in what they do, which is that after knight e2, you play queen h6. If knight g3, you play knight f6, and the general idea is that you're kind of holding white at bay. So probably white should play maybe a move like a5 to paralyze, but it's very hard to do anything because if white tries to play queen b3 and take the pawn, then the black queen can come in. Notice how the queen is hitting this pawn, which is making it hard for black to move. But I think here, in general, black should be doing okay. I don't think there's anything too horrible. And I wanted to note also that if white tries to go for, more concrete play, black goes here. And I think this position is actually not good for white at all, because if you trade queens, black's king is hugely superior in the endgame. So I think that endgame would actually be like really terrible for white. I don't think that's a good idea. But Irina plays here, so Alice plays knight e2. Again, maneuvering the knight. In this position, I couldn't find a defense, really. Like, maybe there is one. I think computer finds rook h7 and putting the king on h8. Good luck with that. I was looking at a5, knight g3, and then king f8, something like this. But this is still atrocious. White can play here. If you defend the pawn, I play queen b3, and I mean, you're falling apart. But it was funny. My instinct was close the queen side, close the queen side. And what's really funny is Irina played b5. Now, again, I think this is just she was quite desperate, is my impression. That's why she played it. So it's understandable. But I do want to make a note here that this is an interesting thing that happened. Initially, remember how initially white wanted to play a3, b4? But because white's castled over on the queen side and black is not, a3, b4 became a poor idea, right? In this particular position, or rather later, black's b5 idea became a great idea to open up the queen side, right? But I want you to note that as the position evolves, it often changes which pawn breaks you should play. In this position, even though, again, I think here there weren't that many wonderful or easy options, so it's an understandable move, I think that here opening up the queen side is horrible for black. And the reason why is because black's king is actually the one vulnerable because of these pieces and how poor they are. It was really amazing how Alice turned around the fact that her pieces were all terrible, and then all of a sudden her pieces were the better ones. It's not so easy to do that in a locked position. So yeah, this b5 move I actually think gives Alice many chances. Knight g3, f6. And here she did something which is very good. I think I wanted to go hog wild and play something like b4 when I was watching. It's nice when it's not your game. You can play crazy moves. But the idea is just I want to rip this open and basically say, yeah, your king is going to be dead, right? For example, if you take, I think c5. If you take, I might throw in knight h5 check at some point when I feel like it, but something like this. Notice how the knight can't move. Knight h5 check is coming. You can't take advantage of my king because you have no pieces that can attack it. Rook h1 is in the air. Queen d6. I mean, this is something like this I thought would be a disaster. But Alice's way is simpler. She takes in place queen a3. She's like, I don't have to be that gung-ho. King f7, queen a7, king e7. And this is maybe Alice's last mistake. It's not fatal, and I think it's still winning. She finds some accurate moves afterwards. But I think the simplest way to win here is with c takes b5. The idea being that white, you're threatening just a queen. Black's only try is this. You play rook h1. And if queen takes h1, you actually get the same position as in the game, except you're up a tempo because you got in this move. So white can even just play king c1 and then just push the pawn, and it's game over. And if black takes, the key is just you make sure there's no perpetual. But you'll notice that you can simply get out of it. The king's very well defended. You're going to take the knight or play rook h7 check, depending on what happens. This is just over. So that would have been a simpler way to win. Alice plays this. It's partially because she hasn't seen as many fortresses as I have, so I'm always scared that there's some fortress. Here, there isn't one. And she either figured out before or figured out here correctly how to deal with it. So this was just one key moment. She could have played this, and now there's a really cool way to draw for black, which is you play b4. I didn't find a way to prevent it anyway. And then at some point, white plays here, for example, and now knight h6 to f7, and you are never breaking through because your king cannot support you, right? Your king is not a piece, which means that you just need your queen, and black always has different moves. So this is already a relatively long video, but I did want to show how fortresses work very briefly. So in this position, Alice plays king a2, which is a very nice piece of calculation, actually. Rook d4, b6, rook takes e4, b7, rook b4. So I think the main reason she put it on a2 is because, number one, she saw that rook a4 check, winning a queen actually doesn't do very much because you get the queen back. Very important little line. But also because there is a line where black attempts to take this g4 pawn, and then f5 can hang with check if the king's on c2. So very nice little piece of calculation, but this is what happens. Knight h4, knight h6. And this was the key move that Alice found. If you'd like to pause your video, go ahead. So the really key thing is to remember it's not so much about the pawn count. It's about whether your king can participate. So b4 is such an effective move because black cannot allow you to get another passed pawn, so black has to capture it. You're defending g4, but believe it or not, that's not even the most important feature of the position. It's nice to not give it up, don't get me wrong. But the most important feature is now notice how the king has a path in. Eventually the king can get in this way, and that's what happened. So there's lots of stuff that can happen here. Let me just show the general gist. So Alice puts the queen here. Again, I was a little bit surprised. I thought white would just play here and get the king in this way while you're guarding e4. Doesn't matter too much, most likely. So here, so Irina just sits. Alice gets the king in, and we get to a position like this. And this is generally the problem, that in order to create a fortress, this is the last thing I'll leave you with, because it often happens in closed positions. A fortress meaning a position where you're obviously worse or down material, but your opponent simply can't make progress. They can't. It's like you have a big castle. They can't. In fact, sometimes people who don't speak English or a first language refer to a fortress as a castle, because they're synonyms, but a castle is not the right word. But it's fun to say, castle, right? In order to create a fortress, or castle, if you will, you need a few things. Number one, you need to make sure that your opponent can't penetrate, which means that all the crucial squares you have to cover. Here, black has that kind of covered, right? The king can't get in any further, right? The king's cut off. You're defending all of these squares, right? Notice how every square is sort of defended. Every weak pawn is defended, right? d6 and f6 you would call the weak pawns. But there's something else you need in a fortress, and that's something everyone forgets about. You need a spare move. You need to avoid zugzwang, meaning a position where you have no good moves, so you must make a bad one. And that is why this is not a fortress. And again, if Alice saw it ahead of time, kudos. I have a feeling she didn't, and you could say it lucky, you could say her instincts were good, whatever you want to call it. I would not have allowed it just because I've seen too many fortresses in my day. I'm nervous about it. But I think her judgment is spot on here. It's just the main problem is black does not have a spare move. So Irina played e4, but the main problem is if you try to play something like bishop e8, white sneaks in with queen c8, and there's just no way to get out. You can play here, but queen c8, and notice how you're hitting f6 and e8, so you can't play king g7 because the bishop hangs. If you drop f6, white will have an f pawn to attack with. You're not long for this world, let's put it that way. So that's really the crucial part with all of this stuff. So in the game, e4 was played, and then Alice simply picks up the pawn and goes back. Very simple. Creates a similar zugzwang, and Irina can't do much. She plays knight e5. Here there are multiple choices, but she takes the bishop, which is the professional way. The idea being that if knight takes, king takes, you take this d-pawn, play king c7, and that will be the end of the game. So Irina resigned. And this was a really crucial win for Alice. It gave her the win in the second match, so she got to play a playoff match, and she ended up winning that by the skin of her teeth, from what I heard. So again, congratulations to her. And again, I thought that both of them had moments where they played really great in this game, and moments where maybe they lost the plot. Alice lost it earlier, Irina lost it later. But I found it an interesting position to learn from, because again, it was really hard for me to figure out what was going on. It took me quite a bit of time, and sometimes, as I mentioned, like when I checked it, computer is like, nah, buddy. So it's a great way to learn how to play close positions, is by watching strong players play them, and to try to figure out what they're doing right, what they're doing wrong, and kind of work from there. But if you can have takeaways, it's number one, in a closed position, know your pawn breaks, know what pawn breaks are, available to you. But also know that sometimes they're not correct. Doing a pawn break in front of your king when your opponent's king's the other way is often not correct. Notice how there are certain positions where you have to play for your pawn break relatively quickly or you'll get squashed. That's usually the side with less space. The side with more space often should take their time and really perfect their pawn break. And the reason for that is because they have more room to improve their pieces. They often should do so. And the idea is that the more time goes, the more their pieces will improve more than the side with less space. Another one is don't forget about tempi either. Remember the bishop thing in the beginning. Like, just because you want to trade a pair of bishops doesn't always mean you should spend 2 tempi doing it, or 3 tempi doing it, even in a locked position. Even though locked positions, you can more often get away with it because of their slow nature. But they take a lot of getting used to. The way you do it is you play them. Like, that's why people who play like French defense, you can make fun of it all you want. I've been known to. But they learn how to play locked positions, and it's a cool skill. It's not something everyone has. But if you don't have experience in locked positions and want to learn how to play them, choosing some positions where you get it is nice, but also going over games like this, I can tell you I certainly learned from this game, and I'm hoping that all of you could learn as well. So thank you again for watching. Once again, if you are interested in my Chessable course, check it out. The link's in the description. And yeah, if you like these videos, definitely like, subscribe so you can not miss any. It really helps support the channel and helps encourage me to grow it further and to keep at it. So again, appreciate it, and I will see you next time.